We're very pleased to start off the afternoon session with Kevin Zollman from Carnegie Mellon University.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to the organizers for putting this together and for the invitation. I'm really honored to be part of such a distinguished group of people. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite social science tools, which is game theory. One of these theories or tools that has whose death has been declared many times over and yet still keeps going. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why that is, and in fact, make us sort of think about game theory in particular, but also other theories in the social sciences in a slightly different way than the traditional way that philosophers and scientists think about theories or tools in other scientific domains like physics, especially. So for almost, I'm sure, everybody has heard about game theory in one form or another, but I do want to just take a moment to sort of talk about its breadth of applicability, because lots of people, I think, aren't quite aware of how broadly it has penetrated different academic disciplines. So, of course, the name calls to mind games like chess and Go or poker, and it has, in fact, been used to analyze all of those games and has been used in since its invention for that purpose. In fact, in some ways, early game theoretic analyses were specifically about analyzing games of chance in particular. Most famously, it's applied in economics. So a lot of economic micro theory is based on game theory these days. It's so fundamental to economics that it's not even really mentioned. In fact, some people say, "Oh, does this paper even use game theory?" It doesn't use the word, and that's because that's what they're all using all the time. Here's an auctioneer. It's been used in auctions. It's been used in labor negotiations. It's been used in almost every area of economics that you can imagine, and that's, I think, where it's most famous. But it's also widely used in political science at all different scales in political science. So from politics and elections to international relations, game theory has had a long-standing presence in political science. It's also had a growth, especially in recent years, into areas that we think of as maybe more softer of the social sciences in a sense. So people have started using game theory to try and understand discrimination and injustice, to try and understand the perpetuation of different kinds of social norms, both good ones and bad ones, and what we can do to help change those social norms. All of these applications are very much human-based, but game theory has had a very, very long presence in biology as well, where it's applied to all sorts of things like herding behavior, mating behavior, signaling between potential mates or potential rivals, fighting behavior, and a whole host of others. And in the biological kingdom, it's not even the more sort of large-scale or complex organisms that have game theory applied to them. It's applied all the way down to single-cellular organisms, viruses, to things that we might regard as very simple, and that oftentimes seem a bit strange to people who've heard about the economics game theory, because these aren't the kinds of things that have intentions or desires or plans. But nonetheless, it has been incredibly fruitful. And in fact, we have Simon here, who's done an enormous amount of very important work on applying game theory in biology. And more recently, with innovations in robotics and artificial intelligence, now game theory has become a central tool in computer science, machine learning, robotics, and all of those areas as well. So game theory is one of those things that's applied almost any time you have more than one thing interacting with with other things, right? Anytime there's sort of any kind of social interaction. The thing that's really interesting about game theory is, despite this fact that it has made this enormous penetration across academia, people have been predicting its demise almost as long as it's existed. So to pick on one of my own philosophers, here's Francesco Guala in 2006 saying, game theory has been refuted. In fact, precisely 5 years before the publication of this paper, that is 2001. But nobody noticed in the intervening 5 years until Guala was kind enough to point it out. On the right, I've posted a Google Ngram search for 3 common terms used in game theory, and noted the experiments that Guala cites and when he published his paper, and no one has noticed since then either, it appears. Game theory continues on unabated. And this isn't, I'm not going to go into the details of Guala's argument and refute him or comment on on him any more than just to poke at him a little bit here. Those who are interested, it's an interesting paper. I'd encourage you to read it. But what I do want to say is that I think that this is the wrong way to think about game theory. That game theory has not been refuted, and in a certain sense cannot be refuted, because not because it's a tautology, but because it's so flexible and has so many auxiliary assumptions that it can always accommodate things within game theory. And so the question about game theory is more a question about its usefulness, not about its truth or its status as either being refuted or not. And I hope that to convince you of that in the rest of this talk. But before I do that, let me tell you a story that every philosopher will roll their eyes that I'm telling, because we tell our undergraduates this story in Intro Philosophy of Science every single time, right? And this is a story of Le Verrier and the discovery of one planet and the purported discovery of another. So Le Verrier noticed that there were perturbations in the orbit of Uranus, which were inconsistent with Newtonian theory of gravity, and predicted that the explanation for this was the presence of another planet which hadn't yet been observed. And he was right. Neptune was out there. As a result of his predictions, people went looking, and they found it. That's a great success, right? He used the theory, made a prediction. The prediction was borne out. But he wasn't done. He had more things to notice. He noticed that Mercury's orbit was also inconsistent with Newtonian mechanics. And I mean, he had a strategy, and it worked before. So he said, well, maybe there's another planet, Vulcan, which might be inside of the orbit of Mercury, which might be causing these perturbations. There is no Vulcan. Sorry to Star Trek fans out there. And he was wrong there. Now, the reason that this story is interesting to philosophers of science is because of the perfect symmetry between what he did, right? He did the same thing twice. Once it worked, and once it didn't work. And the reason that that's interesting is because when you make those sort of modifications by postulating an unobserved entity or by modifying a theory in a novel way or something like that, sometimes people cry foul because they say, oh, you're just making an ad hoc modification in order to save the theory. But you can't antecedently tell whether it was a good one or a bad one, because as in the case of Le Verrier, he did it twice and he was right once. So returning to game theory for a minute, what I'm going to argue is that kind of modification is something that we see in game theory all the time, and that people who don't like game theory view it as an unfair move, and people who do like game theory view it as a fair move, and that the answer, just like with Le Verrier, is not going to be an answer that we can immediately say that's a fair move or an unfair move, but rather it's something that will just have to be borne out in further experiments, further observations, and further testing. Okay, so let me give you game theory in a slide. My apologies to the game theorists in the audience, but I hope this does justice to it. When a game theorist confronts a problem or a phenomena that they want to try and explain, the first step that they do is they define a game, which at its minimum has to include who are the players, what are their strategies, and what are their payoffs. Payoffs can mean lots of different things depending on the domain of application. So it could mean utility to a human being, it could mean fitness to an animal, it could mean reward function to a robot, it could mean a lot of different things. But that by itself doesn't do anything. The game is just a mathematical object. We have to know what it is the mathematical object tells us. And so then we have to choose from amongst a number of different ways to use that mathematical object to make a prediction. So most famously are what are called equilibrium concepts. Maybe you've heard of the Nash equilibrium. That's one of them, but that's just one of them. There is, in fact, a whole zoo of these things that are related to one another in complicated ways. There's also other approaches in game theory. There's an approach called evolutionary game theory, which started in biology, but now is being used everywhere, where you don't postulate an equilibrium, you postulate a dynamic, a process by which people change their strategies over time. There's also another area of game theory called epistemic game theory, where you don't do that, you postulate what people know, and then you use that to derive what you think they're going to do. And then you use that as a prediction about what people are going to do, but you have freedom there also. You can say, am I predicting what they're going to do the first time they play a game, or after they play a game multiple times, or on average what will happen, or something like that. So already I hope I'm sort of showing you that when a game theorist approaches a problem, they have an enormous number of degrees of freedom. They can change the number of players, the utilities, the payoffs, the equilibrium concept, the knowledge constraint, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They have an enormous amount of freedom in terms of how they define a particular thing. And I want to illustrate how that freedom is both powerful, but also makes it basically impossible to test game theory writ large, but only to test specific instances of game theory. So the first one is very famous. You may well have heard of it, and I want to just use it as an illustration, which is a large amount of experiments done about humans' behavior in context where fairness might be relevant. The most famous of these anomalies, as they're sometimes called, is the ultimatum game. So if you haven't heard of the ultimatum game, it's very, very simple. There are two players, Anne and Bob. Anne proposes a split of some resource, say $10 to Bob. She says, we've got $10. I'd like to keep 6, and you can have 4. Bob learns of what Anne's proposal is, and then Bob can either accept or refuse. He has no other options. He either says yes or no. If he says yes, they get what Anne proposed, and if he refuses, they both get nothing. The money is wasted, or it's spent on the TA who's administering the experiment, or something like that. It's never spent on the TA who's administering the experiment. So what's the anomaly here? Well, classical game theory, and I want to really emphasize that classical game theory predicts that Bob should accept anything because he's always getting a choice between nothing and something is better than nothing, so he should accept any amount of money. And if that's the case, Anne should realize that and therefore offer Bob almost nothing, right? So whether she offers him exactly 0 or offers him the smallest, quanta of money that she can, is a little bit of a rabbit hole to fall down, but that's the classic economic model. Now, that's the classic economic model that's built on a bunch of assumptions, and those assumptions are several of the choices that I just mentioned that game theorists can make. So the reasoning that I just gave you is a version of an equilibrium concept called subgame perfection. So you've chosen an equilibrium concept, subgame perfection. My reasoning relied on Bob caring only about money. Nowhere in here did I mention fairness or anger or resentment. The two players expect that this interaction will be anonymous because, of course, if Bob could come and set fire to Anne's car if she's unfair to him, then that changes the game. And also that all of this is known by all of the players, right? So that's classical economics oftentimes makes those assumptions. And so the thing that is a problem from this perspective is that's not what humans do. No surprise, as probably many of you have already thought about what you might do. People regularly offer more than the minimum. Offers that are very small are often refused. And there's been an incredible series of studies done in the early 2000s and into the 2010s doing this across a variety of different cultures, and things get really crazy. There are cultures where regularly Anne offers more than half to Bob, and then he refuses. And so there's all sorts of really complicated things that go on, right? None of which are predicted by classical game theory. And in fact, it gets even worse. If we take away Bob's strategies and just say Bob doesn't have a choice, he has to accept, it's still the case that Anne will sometimes offer more than the minimum. She offers less, actually, it turns out, but more than that. Okay. So how do we respond to this huge, and there are an almost uncountable number of ultimatum game experiments. How do we respond to these? Well, one thing we might respond to these is say, game theory is wrong. It's been refuted. And in fact, the classical game theory model that I described has been refuted. People don't do what that model predicts. There's no question about that. But as you probably have already guessed, I'm going to say there's lots of other things that we could do. We could change the utility function. We could add in things like a desire for fairness or anger or resentment or any of these other number of things. We could say that we've got the wrong game. In fact, some of these experiments, they had a really hard time convincing people that God wasn't going to punish them because they had a religion that believed that if they were unfair to somebody else, they would eventually get punished by God, and that changes the game. We could change the equilibrium notion. We could change the model of common knowledge. We could change any of those other things. And this isn't just, I'm a philosopher and I know how obnoxious we can get. This isn't just, oh, we could do this. People have done it, right? So this relatively famous paper from 1999 by Farr and Schmidt, it specifically said, let's include one thing. Well, I mean, it's one somewhat mathematically complicated thing, which is a preference for fairness. And if that preference for fairness, can we then fit that model to the ultimatum game experiments in a way that make them consistent with game theory? In fact, the method in this paper takes game theory as an axiom that says people are playing the equilibrium. Let's figure out what their utility function must be in order to make it so that they're playing the equilibrium. right? So this series of experiments and theoretical work is not only is it not refuting game theory, it's actually using it as a kind of a working posit for the experiment. And indeed, they do, although it's controversial, because then if you take it to different experiments, the same utility function doesn't quite fit, so maybe they've missed something. I'm not going to necessarily say that I think they got it right, but this is just a point about the flexibility is something that people really are taking advantage of regularly. And so there's this question: is this okay? There, by the way, is Leverrier imagining the Schmidt utility function. It is a little bit more complicated than just amount of money, and so as a result, has a couple of extra free parameters, which allows for all sorts of problems. And what I'm going to suggest is we can't say necessarily whether that's okay. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with it, just as there was nothing intrinsically wrong with Leverrier postulating the existence of Neptune or the existence of Vulcan. It's only on further testing and experimentation do we determine if this new model of Schmidt is a good model of people's play in the ultimatum game. And if that turns out to be wrong, that's not the end of game theory either, because of course they only include one thing. You could include others, and lots of people have done that. And this isn't an isolated example. I haven't cherry-picked one. This same process has happened with cooperation in apparent prisoners' dilemmas, something that economists call cheap talk, or pre-play communication. There's a very interesting series of theoretical results that in classic game theory, auction format shouldn't matter. All auctions are the same. It's called the revenue equivalence theorem. But in experiments, all auctions aren't the same. And so now people are trying to figure out what's gone wrong with the classic model. So there are lots and lots and lots of these examples. I'm not going to go into those. In fact, I want to shift and say that was a human-based game theoretic example. Let me give you another one now from biology, which has, in some ways, a similar structure. Game theory gets used in biology in a lot of different ways. The one that's closest to my heart is signaling, because that's where I've published, and I'm an academic, so I love all my babies. And one of the one of the classic examples, and let me be careful here and say that there's everything about this example could be disputed, but let me give you the textbook example, which is the peacock. So we all know the peacock. The male is the one with the giant tail, very colorful, obviously completely ridiculous. It could not serve any potential purpose other than potentially attracting mates, is what people think it probably is for. Now, in attracting mates, there are many different theories about how it attracts mates exactly. There are a lot. I'm going to give you the two most prominent ones. One is called the signaling hypothesis, and this is sort of the game theory model. This is where the idea is that the peacocks vary in terms of some underlying quality that is unobservable to peahens. That's something like parasite load, hunting ability, a willingness to provide for the young. Who knows? Like, there's huge long list of potential things, right? And female can't observe that. The peahens can't observe that, but they can observe the tail, obviously. And so the tail is functioning as a signal. It's doing the same thing that a Rolex watch does for somebody who's trying to signal that they're at least wealthy enough to buy a Rolex watch, right? So that's the idea. And in fact, it's the same models, both in economics and biology. Weirdly, they got invented independently, and then it's not until quite recently that people have figured that out. So that's the game theoretic. There's a game theoretic model that shows how that works. It's an equilibrium. It can evolve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it has very particular predictions about what needs to be true about both the unobserved quality and also the tail itself. Critically, the tail needs to be unfakeable in a certain respect. So it has to come with a cost. It has to be expensive in some way. How is it expensive is not clear, but you can imagine the guesses, right? It takes energy to grow. It probably makes it harder to evade predators. It might even attract predators, other things. That's the game theory explanation. The other explanation is called sexual selection, sometimes called the sexy sons hypothesis. And this idea is that the tail actually doesn't signal anything at all. It's the result of a runaway process selecting for attractiveness and nothing else. So the idea here is that Initially, there might be some arbitrary, completely accidental preference in the female population for slightly longer than average tails. So that means that the males with the slightly longer tails have more mating success, which means that there'll be more of them in the next generation. Interestingly, that also means that females who have that preference will have sons who are more attractive in the next generation. And so the preference gets selected as well as the tail. This is a feedback process that elongates the tail and makes the preference stronger, et cetera, and goes until it sort of reaches some kind of barrier where it gets too costly to maintain or it's just physically impossible. You could also put this in game theory language, although it usually is not. And so I'll take this as the non-game theory explanation. Now, the thing that's tricky, and that any philosopher of science will tell you is hard about the signaling hypothesis, is the hypothesis itself, the models itself don't tell you what the trait is. They say there is some unobserved trait, but I don't know what it is. So the signaling theory postulates that we will find such a trait. But it doesn't say where to look for a trait. It doesn't say what it is. It doesn't say how to measure it. It doesn't say anything about it. And the sexy sons hypothesis just says we won't find such a trait. And this is really hard to do scientifically because you can postulate one trait and see if it correlates with the tail. And what if it doesn't? Well, maybe you just got the wrong trait. Maybe you need to look for yet another one. And so the problem here is it's never clear that we've refuted the signaling hypothesis. We've refuted a version of the signaling hypothesis by showing that it wasn't parasite load, or showing it wasn't foraging ability, or showing it wasn't something else, but we haven't proven that it's correct, which means the sexy sons hypothesis, there's no affirmative test for it, right? There's no way to say this is obviously the correct answer over signaling, because we'll never be able to eliminate the possibility that there's not a yet unobserved trait that we haven't necessarily found. Okay, so same thing, right? Same question here. The signaling hypothesis, the reason that this debate, and I should say, it's not just about peacocks. This debate about which of these two processes explains a whole multitude of communication that occurs prior to mating is ongoing. People ask it about coloration in guppies. They ask it about mating dances in birds. They ask it about human mating rituals. They ask it about lots of different things. And it's largely unresolved. There's work and there are tricks and ways to try and figure this out in some species where we can measure certain kinds of things. But it's I think it's actually unlikely to be ever fully resolved, because there was always the possibility that there's a yet unobserved thing. And what makes it especially difficult, as the biologists in the audience will tell you, measuring fitness is not an easy thing to do, especially in long-lived species like humans and primates. And so we might not be able to figure it out. So the same thing is happening here, right? Theories are getting refuted. There have been papers that say we prove that the signaling hypothesis isn't correct in this species because with respect to the specific trait, but that doesn't refute the signaling hypothesis. That just refutes it with respect to that particular trait. You can always postulate a new trait, just like you can postulate a new planet, and you can test, and you can go looking for that too. And it's not that there's an infinite number of traits, but there sure are a lot of them. And so it's not a process that's likely to end anytime soon. And just like with the ultimatum game, this isn't an isolated example, right? Signaling in mates is ubiquitous, but also there is all sorts of other sorts of signaling that happens in biology. There's lots of work about signaling what gets called resource holding potential, something like your ability to win at a fight. And then there are lots and lots and lots of other what are called role conditioned games, where the underlying role, like is it territory, is it who's stronger, who's bigger, who's older, who's younger, who's what, this, that, or the other thing, that have these sort of hidden traits that we can always postulate. Okay. So what I hope I've convinced you with these two examples and them as representative of a more broader thing is that some of the things that people say about game theory is just wrongheaded. It's not the right way to think about it. Game theory cannot be falsified or confirmed or tested as a whole. It's not the kind of thing that you can do that. And one cheeky thing I sometimes say when people ask me if game theory has been refuted, I ask them if they think calculus has been refuted. And they say, well, no, of course not. Usually they say calculus is not the kind of thing that can get refuted. Certainly theories that use calculus have been refuted. That's no surprise. And I think game theory should be thought of much more like that, like a mathematical tool that makes no predictions on its own. And the cheeky title of this talk is that it's not a theory. Game theory is not a theory, right? It's not the traditional thing that we mean by theory. It's not like a theory of gravity or a theory of natural selection or something like that. Instead, I think we need to think about it differently. Now, you might think from that previous slide, when I say it can't be falsified, that therefore I'm saying it's unscientific or something like that. But that is not what I'm saying. It is indeed good science, right? But it is what it is a toolbox for the creation of specific theories. And those specific theories very much are testable. They very much are the kinds of things that we can falsify or confirm or test in various ways. And so it's not that it's part of some kind of pseudoscientific enterprise where we're coming up with theories that we could never test, but rather game theory is not going to be tested. Those individual theories can be tested, where those individual theories are something like people in the ultimatum game care only for money and will follow the game theoretic prediction as if they only care for money, right? That has been falsified, and I agree it's been falsified. And so as a modeling approach, we shouldn't ask a question about it. We shouldn't say, is it true or false? That's just the kind of the wrong, that's a category mistake. Instead, we ask whether it's useful or useless. I love it. I think it's useful. This talk is not aimed to convince you that it's useful. So if you don't think it is, that's fine. Well, it's not fine by me, but we'll talk later. But the thing is, I think that what I want to convince you of, and what I hope I have convinced you of, is that that the way we should think about it is as something that's useful or useless, but not true or false, confirmed or falsified. And I think that it's one of many ways at looking at a particular phenomenon. And this is not where I'm going to dive into this, but I actually think that this sort of fits into a pluralist a model of science, much like what Sandra Mitchell has advocated in the past, or a perspectival way of thinking about it, where game theory provides us a lens through which we can think about particular phenomena and think about how to design models of particular phenomena, but not necessarily the kind of thing that we should think of as a theory or strictly true or false. And so if I can just step back for just a quick moment and say what I've said about game theory, I think is actually true of a lot of social science models of large-scale complex social phenomena. That is, almost always, large-scale social phenomena is an incredibly difficult process where we have to design models of it. And because human beings are complicated, or animals are complicated, and large-scale phenomena are complicated, and there's so many potential inputs, there are always going to be, those models will always have many different moving parts that will be changeable. And so I think that this desire that sometimes gets imported into the social sciences from more traditional physical sciences and biological sciences is that we really shouldn't think of our desire as something like an exactly true theory. And we shouldn't judge large-scale approaches like game theory or network theory or any of these sorts of things as the kinds of things that should be true or false. I think it's more obvious that that's true about networks, less obvious about game theory. It's really much more about, are these insightful? Are these tools that help us to build useful theories or help us to see things about the system that we're studying that we didn't see before? And so I would encourage us in social sciences more generally to move away a little bit from the rhetoric of testing, falsification, confirmation, these sorts of things, these concepts that we teach in our introductory philosophy of science classes, and think much more in terms of what philosophers would call instrumental virtues. That is, are they useful? Are they enlightening? Do they help us understand the phenomena better? That sort of thing, rather than thinking about them as true or false. Because I think that while true or false is certainly something we might want in physics, it's just not something we're likely to get in the social sciences. And if we were to get it, it might not actually do the things we want our social scientific theories to do, which is help us to understand complex phenomena that themselves are very difficult to understand without some form of simplification. All right, thank you very much.
I will start by saying that I face some difficulties in being a commenter First of all, because I agree in particular with a lot of what Kevin said towards the end. And secondly, because I'm a political scientist, and political scientists, we aren't particularly good at being obnoxious in useful ways. We tend to be kind of mealy-mouthed, conciliatory in all sorts of unhelpful fashions. So, but my job is, as commentator, not just to repeat what has been said, but obviously to try and add something new and a little bit different. So what I want to do is I want to start from what Kevin said towards the end, and to say, this seems absolutely right. As a practicing social scientist, it does seem to me that we do want a plurality of models. We want many, many different models to try and make sense of an extremely complex world. All of these models and these modeling techniques, they are compressions of this far more complex social reality that we face and that we're never going to be fully able to discipline in the ways that we would like. And so, furthermore, game theory is an extremely useful addition to that variety of techniques that we have. It's very important. It's very helpful. There are things that it really shows us that other approaches do not show in the same kinds of ways. It does involve a lot of assumptions. We assume that by and large, at least the kind of game theory that I'm familiar with, that human beings, that we have complete information about what the game looks like, even if it's incredibly complex, that we have remarkable calculative abilities which allow us to look down extremely complex game trees to figure out the probabilities if we're not quite sure which part of the game tree we're at. All of these other assumptions that you make in order to allow the math to simplify in neat and lovely ways. And when that works, it works extremely well. Equally, I think that game theory is not just a modeling technique. It can also serve as what Deirdre McCloskey calls a kind of rhetoric. Crudely speaking, you can come up with a game theoretic model that provides you with an ex post explanation or simplification for pretty well anything that you observe. And the infamous folk theorem in a non-cooperative game theory more or less suggests that under plausible parameter values with reasonable assumptions and sort of minimax conditions being satisfied for all of the players, that more or less any equilibrium is possible in an indefinitely iterated game. So you have this world in which, in a certain sense, this is a rather free-flowing form of rhetoric in which you can more or less describe anything that you want and give it a plausible patina of mathematical apparatus to make it sound much more convincing and much sexier than it perhaps is. And there are social scientists who go down that route. So this presents us, I think, with a complicated set of trade-offs as practitioners. So I don't think about this as a philosopher, but I think about the more pragmatic, small p pragmatic question. When do you choose a particular model? And equally importantly, when do you decide that a particular model that you thought was helpful for describing a phenomenon no longer is the best model for describing it? And you have these choices. You can either choose to move from one model to another, from one of the many variety of models that you have, or you can try to keep on refining the model that you have. Perhaps I'm sort of at a certain point, I'm sort of effectively degenerating into pure rhetoric. And as Kevin says, there's some of the criticisms of the Farrer and Gachter and other people who make this move is that this can turn into rhetoric, that you can always come up with some kind of ex post hypothesis or ex post formulation. You can come up with weird equilibrium concepts, all of these different tools that allow you to, in a certain sense, keep on adding epicycles to preserve the phenomenon. And I don't think we have any very good guidelines sort of on a general way to say which model works best. There is interesting work by people like Danny Roderick, Scott Page, for example, who talk about how it is that you choose particular models for particular circumstances. But part of being a good social scientist is, I think, having a set of good instincts and set of good rules of thumb for deciding which model works where. And I want to give a quick example of this from political science, which is a truly wonderful model. This is a model of democracy that Adam Pravorsky came up with about 30 odd years ago, which has really been profoundly influential within political science. And I think it shows the power and the value of game theory. So what Pravorsky does more or less is that he says, how do we think about what democracy is from a game theoretic perspective? And he suggests that it is a system in which parties lose elections. This may sound like a really crude sort of model. It may not sound like it provides a lot of insight, but actually it does. Because if you think about this from the perspective of a government party, a ruling party which has all of the power, which has control of the apparatus of government, why would it ever, if it is a rational actor, if it is presumably interested in the benefits of government, why is it that it would ever let go of this when it had lost an election? And so Pravorsky works through the reasons why, crudely speaking, that it would be worse off, very likely, and also that it has some unquantifiable chance of winning in a future election, and more or less suggests as a result that this provides us with a pretty solid theory of democratic stability. And crudely speaking, that this comes together with a variety of empirical results to suggest that when societies have gotten to a certain stage of wealth, if they are democracies, the democracy is going to be spectacularly stable because nobody wants to upset the apple cart. Everybody recognizes that they will lose if they decide to dispute an election, and therefore democracy is going to keep on going on and on and on. Pravorsky's ideas then give rise to a whole little cottage literature of people coming up with models of democracy as a self-enforcing equilibrium. Now, of course, there is a problem with that approach, which we can recognize. And I will not say that this has been falsified, because this is, as Kevin says, exactly the wrong way to go about thinking about these questions. But it does suggest that there are some important limits to this particular game theoretic model. Now, there are different approaches you might take to try to fix this. You might try to add different assumptions. You might try to qualify. You might try to come up with more sophisticated models. Game theory does provide you with a lot of means of doing this. Equally, and I think that this is perhaps the more valuable way, you can begin to look at some of the guiding assumptions of game theory and think about ways in which these modeling techniques and strategies lead you, precisely because they're compressions, to focus on some aspects and not to focus on others. So in particular, I think game theory encourages you to do two things. If you're working with a specific kind of non-cooperative game, you are more or less assuming that whatever interactions there are between the game theoretic equilibrium and the environment, they are one way from the environment to the equilibrium. So in other words, the actions of the actors themselves do not affect the environment within which they are working. And the relationship is pretty simple. Crudely speaking, if the equilibrium can be maintained within a given set of parameter values, it goes on. If the parameter values shift for some exogenous reason, then it stops. That obviously excludes a lot of important things, a lot of important ways in which the actions of the actors themselves can reshape the environment that they're in. Equally, we could look at other aspects. So as I say, game theory assumes that human beings are effectively extremely powerful individual calculators. We know that, in fact, this is not true. Herbert Simon and others have pointed out the ways in which our limited individual squishy brains don't actually get us nearly as far as we would like. And so we have all of these artificial systems. We call them bureaucracies. We call them markets. Allison and Cosma and I have a paper that came out recently which argued that large language models can be considered in a similar light. All of these systems, which effectively their job is to compensate for our inabilities to do things right. They allow us to form collective beliefs. They allow us to coordinate. And so if we are looking to the ways in which democracy does not seem to behave in the ways that we might expect if individuals were perfectly rational, we might begin to look at those different structures and systems and see if the ways in which they mediate in the formation of the collective beliefs that allow equilibriums to work or not work may not be working particularly well. So what this suggests, I think, is, very straightforwardly that First of all, choosing models is difficult. Figuring out when to stop using models is also difficult. And finally, much of the values of models and modeling strategies like game theory lies not in the valuable compressions that they provide, and Przeworski's approach is still incredibly valuable as a way of thinking about democracy, but also in that they force us to think more specifically about the things that a particular model does not do, and that has some epistemic value as well. Thanks.